So let's take a little bit of time and talk about this. Just what is a writing strategy? You'll notice that writing is in parentheses because writing isn't the only type of strategy. We can have strategies for reading, mathematical problem solving, and a variety of other academic tasks. So here's one way to think about what a writing strategy is. Think of it as a teacher-provided technique or tool designed to foster student success on writing and other future learning tasks. Writing strategies make it very clear to our students what successful writers do. And over time, students should work to develop a variety of strategies that they can use in different types of writing and in other subject areas. In other words, the more tools that our students know how to use well, the more likely they are to be successful in writing. So to help illustrate this, let's look at an example of a lesson plan. And really, it's not too bad. So let's say that it's a Monday and my students walk in, and to get their attention, I have an anticipatory set or engagement hook all set up. Around the room, on each of the tables, I have these jars of pickled pig's feet, and I've uncapped them just enough to allow the aroma fill the room. As my students trickle in, some of them say, "Whoa, what's that smell?" I simply reply, "That is our assignment for today." As they settle in, I introduce the essential question. And for this lesson, it is, how can we describe something to someone else if they have never before experienced it? And we talk about different examples, such as, have you ever tried to explain one of your favorite movies to somebody else, and they just didn't think it was nearly as cool as you did? Or have you ever tried to explain to somebody else one of your favorite foods, and they just couldn't get a sense of how delicious and wonderful it was to you? As a teacher, I might share an example of one of my favorite foods, a white bean Brazilian dish called mocato, which is made of course, white beans, as well as the hooves and stomach of a cow, mixed up with just the right amount of bacon and sausage. Now, typically, my students don't think that sounds as delicious as I do. So I might also share a story of a friend of mine who has a hobby that I just don't quite get. In this case, my friend loves dirt bikes, loves taking huge jumps and fly through the air. In fact, here's one of his recent jumps. When my friend tries to explain to me what it feels like, sounds like, and the exhilarating emotion that he feels when doing these jumps, I just don't quite get it. So that's our question for today in this lesson. How can we describe something to someone else if they have never before experienced it? Now that I have my students' attention and have introduced why what we are working on today matters, I introduce the learning objectives for the day. And the learning objectives will be based on content standards. In this case, the content standard I'm working with my students on is to use precise words and phrases, relevant descriptive details, and sensory language to capture action and convey experiences and events. That's the English Language Arts Standard for writing 7th grade. Now, that's a little bit too jargony for my students. So the learning objective that I would put in front of them and discuss would be this. We will work to use precise words and phrases, descriptive details, and sensory language. I might even have my students discuss and try and put into their own words, what does it sound like that we'll be doing today, based on what you see in our learning goal. And then I would probably move into modeling what it is that my students will be doing today, demonstrating how we might brainstorm words, phrases, and vivid details as we describe a life experience that someone hasn't experienced for themselves. After modeling how to go about this, I would allow my students opportunities to practice, brainstorming their own vivid details of the pickled pig's feet that we've set out in class. As my students are working, and as my students get to work brainstorming, I would work to ensure that I'm providing them feedback, both to individual students as well as to the entire class. In other words, helpful hints about how they can improve what it is they're working on. And at some point, I would probably decide that they're ready to move on to the next step, which is to turn their brainstorming into writing. I could model how to begin, what sorts of things should be included in it, talk about formatting, and maybe even length. I would also discuss the success criteria with my students to make clear to them what each of the major elements of the writing assignment would be and what different levels of performance might look like. And then my students would engage in independent work or start writing and composing using their ideas. Once student work was submitted, I would seek to provide feedback to the class as well as to individual students in writing conferences. where together we would discuss strengths in the writing and areas for improvement. Then each student would be invited to take an opportunity to revise and improve their work. So like I said before, really not too bad of a lesson. Now let's take a look at the same lesson, but this time including a writing strategy. In other words, a teacher-provided technique or tool designed to foster my students' success on writing, and that they can use in future writing tasks. So again, the first step would be an anticipatory set where they come in and the pickled pig's feet are open, smelling strongly, in order to set the stage for a multi-sensory learning activity. And just like before, we would discuss the essential question: how can we describe something to someone else if they have never experienced it before? Providing my own examples, as well as asking students to share their own. We would then hone in on our learning objective that we will work to use precise words, phrases, descriptive details, and sensory language. However, this time I would pause and introduce a writing strategy in an effort to help my students understand what it is that good writers do. So at this point in the lesson, I would make sure that the strategy is identified. And at this point, I could introduce to my students how, in descriptive and narrative writing, one thing that experienced writers do is to use precise words, phrases, and vivid details. And that they do this by focusing in on the 5 senses: seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, and smelling, and our emotions. We could call this descriptive writing strategy senses plus 1. In other words, the 5 senses plus emotion. I would then explain to them that whenever we're describing an event or an experience, it may not be necessary to use all of the 5 senses plus emotion, and that our audience might be interested more in some types of details than others. Then I could model the strategy in action with a simple graphic organizer, and then describe pickled pig's feet through seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, smelling, emotions. As I worked through each of the categories, I might ask students which type of sensory details might not be best suited for our audience, or for the object or experience being described. And now, as my students engage in individual practice, they're not only engaged in descriptive writing, they're not only writing, but with a strategy used by more experienced authors. And in this case, the students would examine the pickled pig's feet and come up with as many descriptive details as they can about what they smell, see, hear, taste, touch, and feel emotionally. After doing so, they could narrow it down to the categories they feel would best reach their audience. As students work, I could provide feedback and then move on to the next part of the task, reminding them to continue to use the strategy which has been identified, to use the senses plus 1 writing strategy, and to be mindful of what types of details their audience would be most interested in. I would then share the success criteria, or key aspects and elements of the assignment, different levels of performance, and then ask my students to engage in independent work, creating a first draft of precise words, descriptive details, and vivid sensory language. I could have a discussion with my students about what elements of their work are going well, areas for improvement, and ask them to reflect upon how the strategy taught helped them to accomplish the task, and invite them to use the same strategy in future related assignments. The hope would be that over time, each student collects a toolbox of their own, suited to various types of academic tasks. So in summary, what is a writing strategy? A writing strategy is a teacher-provided technique or tool designed to foster student success in writing, and that can be used on future learning tasks.